Item 12, public hearing and discussion of the update to the land use plan categories and ordinance map related to the Edmond Plan 2018. There'll be no vote tonight. Mr. Enns and Mr. Bryan will have some discussion about this. There could possibly be commission comments, and we'll certainly take public comment. So who's going to start this off?
I'll start it off.
Mr. Enns?
Thank you. As you're well aware, in 2014, 15, in that time frame, the process was started to update the Edmond Plan 4. The previous planner, Bob, held several series of meetings and some projections were made, but however, that was never adopted. Bob retired, and when I was hired on, it was expressed to me that the update was needed and there were a few issues that should be addressed as we went through this. In July of 2017, Ken Bryan was hired as the Longrange Planner. This is kind of the main point of his workload right now is this update. Ken came to us from Oklahoma City. He's a certified planner with many years of planning experience. I could say an award-winning planner because the City of Oklahoma City won the Daniel Burnham Award, which is a national award. Ken was the main author of that plan. So it's good that he's here, very good that he's here. After Ken was on board, we met with several stakeholder groups, internal and external. We discussed their long-term plans, any issues they had, and just general issues with the plan. The last several months, Ken has put together a draft that incorporates that information and preserves the vision and intent of Plan 4, and that's what he's here to present to you tonight. So, thank you very much.
Mr. Bryan?
Thank you, sir. Thanks for that introduction. Of course, I can't take full credit for Oklahoma City's success. At least one other person that I know of helped me work on that plan. As Randy indicated, tonight we're going to be discussing where we're at in the proposed update to the Edmond Plan. Currently known as Plan 4. We'll be referring to it in this presentation as the Edmond Plan or Edmond Plan 2018. Today we'll be focusing on the plan categories. So if we can look at the next slide. Rest assured the plan is not full of cartoons. However, I was challenged to describe how the long-range planning process works because we've done some consolidation in the document, but it still runs 70+ pages. And you have to pay attention from the beginning to the end to see how it all fits together. So I came up with kind of a 3-panel graphic here that summarizes all the sections of the plan. So communities tend to set visions and goals that are captured in long-range documents. Of course, Edmond has a long history of doing this. As we start to work towards reaching those visions and goals, we often encounter challenges. And sometimes we need long-range planning actions and policies that build on our community's assets to help us overcome those challenges. So that's what I'm trying to communicate here with that graphic. So with that said, we'll move on to how we worked our way through the update process. So Randy alluded to this time frame. I think an important component that I was able to bring when I arrived in 2017 was a level of stakeholder coordination. And so we were able to reach out to other city departments. Of course, they're impacted by the plan on, if not a daily basis, certainly on some type of recurring or frequent basis. We coordinated with them to make sure that we were addressing challenges with our major service providers. And then the draft document's been prepared, internally reviewed, and we start our external review process this evening. So just want to highlight a few things that have been updated in the plan kind of layout itself. We've tried to reorganize it slightly and simplify the layout so it's easier to use and to consume for a wide audience. The introductory chapters, and those are the introduction to the plan, the community profile, and the vision, those are still unchanged. That constitutes the introduction to the plan. The topic-specific chapters have been the order of those as they appear have been updated, and that's to reflect that the most frequent use of the plan itself is the land use section. So we've moved that chapter as near to the beginning as we can get it. And then the other sections remain largely unchanged in terms of their order: transportation, utilities, economic development, parks and recreation, and implementation. So I wanted to highlight an example of what the an update might look like in terms of current conditions. So this is one that you see updated a lot in all kinds of planning documents, the population projection. So we've done several long-range plans between the adoption of Plan 4 in 2007 and now, and they all have population projections in them. So we were able to build on that. We've moved our population projection out to 2050 at this point. That in and of itself is not fantastic in any way. We are going to cross 100,000 people, so that's somewhat of a landmark or a milestone. However, the makeup of our population is projected to change quite a bit. And you can see we've tried to highlight that in this graphic here. So we're projecting that by 2030, as much as 20% of our population will be age 65 and over. That's a 170% increase in the number of retirees in our community when compared to 2010. That's significant because those demographics have a lot of flexibility in where they choose to live, spend their money, and do all those things. And there's a lot of opportunity for Edmond to participate in that, in attracting and providing services to that age cohort. And the way the projection model works now, we don't see that age cohort decreasing. It's not like there's this wave of retirees and then it goes away. We see the demographics kind of lay out like that for the future. So that's an example of the type of current conditions that we need to update when we do an update on every 10 years or so to a long range plan. So we can go to the next slide. We also had to update the plan in terms of completed tasks and projects. So Plan 4 called for a handful of projects and master plans and those kinds of things to be completed. You can see a few listed here. So a lot of activity has occurred in the last 10 or 11 years as it relates to these topics. Of course, we're familiar with the various transportation plans that we've looked at. A lot of work in the downtown area. A lot of those were called for in Plan 4. The Parks and Recreation Master Plan is a really good example. The Plan 4 almost contained a scoped items for what the Parks and Recreation Master Plan should contain. So they used that strongly to inform their scope and their plan. So we were able to consolidate much of that information and kind of take our approach to Parks and Recreation to the next step, reflecting the work that they had done on the master plan. So let's go to the next slide. So the kind of the main focus of our discussion this evening is on the consolidation of the land use information. So I want to make a quick comment about kind of the process that we use to update the land use component. We had several challenges that we're trying to address, and I'll talk in more detail about them, but we think that the approach that we took to update the land use information addresses those challenges. So Plan 4, of course, contains all of this land use information. The most frequent item that we see used is the Ordinance Plan map. That's the one that everyone's most familiar with. But there are other components of the plan that speak to the character and context of different parts of the city or how development should proceed. There's also numerous policies in the policy table in the back of the land use section. So what we tried to do, if we could click to the next slide, we tried to consolidate all of that information into 21 plan categories. So what is a plan category? Well, we're hopeful that it's a more simple and a consolidated way to address how development should proceed and how it should look and feel. We've kind of covered the what with our zoning code and the subdivision regs and some of those regulatory items. And there's good language in the plan about how that development should be and how it should be evaluated. So things like the character and context that are important to each category, we've tried to include those. Each category talks about its relationship to the transportation network, open space, types of buildings that you see or that would be appropriate in the future, and how important site design is in each category. We're hoping that by bringing all that information together, that it'll be more easier to access and easier to use. So I'm going to describe quickly each plan category, and we'll take a little time to walk through these. I want to make a quick note about zoning districts. So of course the plan is used to evaluate applications for rezoning. That's one of its main kind of day-to-day functions. So what we've tried to do is show that each plan category has appropriate, possible, and inappropriate zoning districts, sort of that stoplight approach to zoning. And we still imagine that the process to evaluate a rezoning application will be of sufficient rigor and robust, but it should provide pointers to both staff, applicants, planning commission, and council as to what zoning kind of matches up with what plan category. So we've got a bucket here of plan categories that are largely residential neighborhoods in character. So our rural neighborhood, of course, that's what you might imagine. It's a very low density residential area. Small amounts of appropriately scaled commercial or civic, such as a small shop or a church, might be appropriate in this area. Of course, the natural setting and the tranquility associated with our rural environment are important. And you can see here we've listed the zoning districts that you might find in the rural area. Mid-century neighborhood. So these are areas of the city that were planned and built largely in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when Edmond was growing at a very fast pace. You often find commercial strips at the edges. A street network often exists in this area, although it might not be as dense as in an urban setting. They usually have multiple connections to the arterial grid. They may have multiple collectors in terms of the streets, and so there's lots of ways to get around in these types of neighborhoods. We're seeing these neighborhoods are now experiencing pressure to transition, and so what I mean by that is 40-ish years is a really long time for an area to remain static. And when they experience pressure to transition, they can either transition in a positive or negative way. We're hoping that the plan provides a framework to help these transitions be more positive. And so you can see here, we've listed some residential zoning districts as well as some of our commercial zoning districts that are designed to fit into neighborhoods. Suburban neighborhoods, the next one there on the list. These are areas designed from the 1990s to present day. They tend to have fewer connections both internally and to the arterial grid than their older compatriots or components. These areas they're relatively new and aren't really experiencing pressure to transition. And so, of course, you see there that these areas will be primarily our A single family areas. An urban neighborhood, those are those are the oldest parts of the city that were built on the gridded street network. Often, of course, they contain historic buildings. They're usually within a 5 to 10 minute walk of downtown. And we're seeing a lot of interest in rehabilitating and infilling vacant parcels in this area, which is good, except that we also need to be sensitive to the existing pattern. And that doesn't mean that we want a new house to be built and look like an old house. It means do your design and site layout in a way that's consistent with the existing framework and fabric, and matches the scale and the scope of the surrounding area. And you see here you get a few more appropriate zoning districts, as you might imagine in an urban area with more activity and more intensity. You can see also this even includes some of the central business district zoning. The next and final neighborhood category, university neighborhood. So this includes UCO and the nearby area. We felt like it was worthy of its own category just based on kind of the diversity of the activity that you see in that area. It's sort of, you see activity there that you wouldn't see other parts of the city that are further away from a university, and that's largely due to the student population and the services that students need. There's four main types of...
Let me stop you there for just a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
If there's anyone in the audience that came in after we started, if you're here for items 4 through 11, those have been continued to the dates on the agenda. Sorry about that.
Thank you. So we've got four types of business-oriented plan categories. First one here on the list is called suburban commercial. That's described as a relatively diverse arrangement of commercial activities, often located near major intersections. A lot of these areas are ready for rehabilitation or intensification. You might see evidence of that if you see a commercial strip and they're working on their facade, or they're making some improvements to the parking lot, maybe adding some trees or working on the lighting or things like that. So that's telling us that the market is starting to kind of reinvest in some of these areas. This next category, is called destination retail. This was largely in response to some concern that we heard about the city needing to do a better job to protect commercial activity. We translated commercial activity to taxable sales, and we should be. Everyone's in the same boat in terms of that in Oklahoma, and we shouldn't have to hide behind our words. We want people to come here and shop. And so you would imagine these are large-scale retail complexes with a large trade area that would extend outside the city limits. You often see them attract other commercial activity. There may be office activity or things like that near or at the edges of these areas. And fortunately, we have 2 zoning districts that are primarily retail in nature, and you can see those listed here. Third one on the list is our employment category. These are locations that are appropriate for concentrations of career track jobs. It's important to talk about the concentration of jobs to help us distinguish between, say, a large warehousing operation that may have a large footprint or a large site but not have a lot of employees, versus something that maybe has a similar footprint or even smaller but has a lot of employees and maybe maybe even shifts and things like that. So that's what we're trying to accommodate in this plan category. So you can see that those kinds of areas would need good connectivity to the highway and or rail network. Kind of a new thing that was mentioned as we were looking at these is that there might be a need for some housing near this area or right at the edge of these areas, and to kind of help manage commute times. When we say near, we might mean, very near, as in you can jump on the bus and get there in 15 minutes, or, shorten your commute from 25 minutes to 10 minutes. It doesn't sound like a lot of time, but that's pretty significant when you're looking at these areas. And you can see that this covers our zoning districts that are appropriate for intense levels of employment. Mixed-use campus. This is a category that's brought over from Plan 4. It features a relatively intense mix of employment opportunities. They feel like close proximity to new or existing residential or commercial areas would enhance their land use pattern. This is one that's special enough that our zoning, we don't have a nice fit on zoning districts. So we've listed here the appropriate zoning district being PUD, and you'll see that in 2 or 3 more of our plan categories as we go forward. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so we have a handful of categories that didn't fit nicely into one of the other buckets, or wanted to highlight for one or more reasons. Of course, that says 8 types, 4 on this slide, 4 on the next slide. The first one listed there is suburban infill. That's a new category for us. That describes areas that are currently undeveloped but are surrounded by existing development. Because of the nature of being surrounded by existing development, the site being most of these sites are relatively small, we really felt like they require special care and should work hard to contribute something to the area they're coming to. They're trying to, be a new neighbor to an area that already exists, and they should bring something to the overall picture there. And because of that, it seems like the only appropriate zoning district at this point is a PUD. Next one there on the list is a village. This is brought over from Plan 4 as well. This is sort of a rural village, features a dense grid of streets. You might imagine the environment is highly walkable, contains a wide variety of uses, designed primarily to serve the immediate area. If you concentrate activity like this, it also gives us good opportunities to provide civic uses such as libraries, police substation, fire station, those types of things. And it may relieve, at least both of these are located kind of out in East Edmond, and we imagine that intensifying development like this may relieve some of the pressure in the rural area, allow it to stay more rural for a longer time. Of course, you can tell by the description that we may not have a straight zoning district that matches nicely to that, and so you'd imagine that those would be PUDs as well. Third one there on the list, transit district. This is kind of in response to Edmond's participation in the regional transit discussion and authority. The furthest north commuter rail station they've talked about, I'm talking the BNSF corridor here. The furthest north station that we've heard is near Covell, and this is very long-term planning, but that's what we're supposed to try to accomplish here in the comprehensive plan. So right now, we would imagine this area, we don't want to kind of just hold this as nothing until there's a commuter rail station, and then we're all in. But at the same time, so we want to allow some kind of activity here, but maybe like not a subdivision or an office tower or something like that you would imagine would be in place for a very long time in a way that would prevent a future rail activity at this location. And it is a very small area up by Covell and the tracks. The I-35 category, of course, we're all very familiar with this. This is reflective of the zoning overlay. Of course, it's in Title 22. It calls for a relatively high intense level of activity in terms of retail and employment. We have very high performance and aesthetic standards in this area, and we would hope that if there's any modifications, updates, or improvements to the zoning overlay, that the long-range plan can provide policy framework and direction on how those modifications to the code might proceed. So we'll look at the next the next 4 of these. Urban Center, this is pulled over from Plan 4 as well. This is the area around Covell and I-35 that we've been working to develop as our new urban center. And we want that area to support a relatively high intense amount of employers, residents, and as well as have regional attraction. Of course, it has great access due to the interstate and of course, there's ramps on both sides, both northbound and southbound at Covell, so it's relatively easy to get to from the region. And we've seen that the way the zoning is unfolding here is of course PUDs. Downtown core, that's our historic center, kind of our hub of all the activity. A lot of the master planning that's been done over the past 10 or so years has been focused in on this area. Identifies a lot of opportunity for infill, rehabilitation, redevelopment, and of course we have zoning districts that align with that demand in that area as well. Broadway corridor is the next one there on the list. That is a category pulled over from Plan 4 as well. That is the area basically south of the urban district. Urban district's different than downtown core. The urban district legally exists down to 9th Street. So south of 9th Street, all the way to the city limit, is an area that we're just cleverly calling Broadway corridor. Of course, this area has experienced a little bit of disinvestment in the recent past. may be a good target for additional planning effort and additional city intervention. We don't know what the nature of that would be at this point, but it may require a more detailed study and planning. Excuse me. Water quality restoration, that is a new category, but it's got some of the same content that we're familiar with in terms of our lake preservation zoning districts and our Arcadia Lake overlay. These areas are specifically adjacent to Arcadia Lake. When I mean adjacent in this regard, I mean in terms of drainage. So surface runoff from these sites would flow directly into Arcadia Lake without traveling through any kind of stream network to speak of. So this area is very close to the lake, just outside its floodplain for the most part. We know that the lake has some challenges in terms of water quality. We need development that is proposed in this area to help us start improving the water quality in the lake. The city is going to be involved in doing things like that in the very near future and probably for a very long time into the future. So design and engineering in this area is so specialized that the only good fit right now in terms of zoning is a PUD. So let's take a look at the last set of plan categories. So these are sort of the other. Open space, this is of course pulled over from Plan 4. It includes relatively large areas of floodplain, our largest park, so it's not every park in the system, but the big ones only. It also includes privately owned common area that's, I think it's around 3 acres or more in size is the cutoff we used. Especially common areas that do multiple things like have something to do with drainage or maybe have a recreational component or something like that. So you'll see those designated with the open space category. Agriculture, these are areas where we see farming and ranching. Right now it's assigned to locations where the floodplain intersects prime farmland. So prime farmland is a soil designation that's highly suitable for agricultural activities. And of course we have a zoning district that lines up very well with this. Excuse me. The last two here, civic or institution. So those are things we needed a category like that to capture things that don't fit well, kind of stand alone. You might think about a very large campus like a high school. Doesn't seem to be a good fit for the other categories. Or are in an area where they're surrounded by a lot of undeveloped land and maybe they have a very large site at this point. You might think of maybe a large church or something like that might also fall into this category. Utilities or infrastructure, those are the treatment plants and the water towers and things like that. Large substations are designated with the utilities or infrastructure category. Okay, so I promised that we consolidated the land use information. So you'll find all of these in your packet, one sheet for each plan category. So you can see that there's a page associated with each plan category that includes all those components I mentioned and goes into some detail about the zoning and the performance criteria onto one page. So one page for each plan category. So let's look at the next slide here and look at the top portion of one of these pages. So this,
I don't know if you can see it in the audience, but he's working from suburban neighborhood.
okay, so I'm not going to go into the detail about this particular plan category. I just want to point out that each and every one of the categories I just walked through has a section that describes its context and character, the types of buildings that we currently see or we could see in the future, a little bit of detail on site design, a little bit of detail on the transportation network, how circulation might work. That includes circulation of vehicles and pedestrians, some discussion of access, whether if you're near the trail system, say, we need you to connect to and contribute to our trail network. Utility access, of course, is always a big deal when it comes to evaluating development. And then a comment about the public space types that will be appropriate or that you might find in this plan category. I want to note here, public space types are any types of spaces where the public could gather or be. Those aren't necessarily publicly owned spaces. A lot of them are, but they don't have to be. And so that's all the information about how development should participate with these plan categories. So let's go next. And down at the bottom of each of these pages is sort of that stoplight approach to zoning that I discussed. So you'll see the appropriate zoning districts. Now, that doesn't mean that you just get that by default. You still are, an applicant would still be subjected to the same zoning process that we have now. No changes proposed to that. Same rigor of staff evaluation, planning commission hearing, and et cetera. But you would imagine that if you're requesting a zoning district that's appropriate for your plan category, your path should be easier because you'll be prepared to answer the questions that we're going to ask you about the character and context that we just told you the answer to in the 3 or in the 5 rows right above. So the yellow districts, or the yellow kind of zones there, we refer to those as possible. What we mean is you might be able to get one of those districts if the setting is just right, you have a really small site, or there's some, there may be something about your site that means that you could get one of these, but you have a little more work to do as an applicant to describe how it's appropriate that one of those zoning districts in the yellow will work for you. We provided right under that some performance criteria that will help an applicant describe how their proposed zoning that's in a yellow category is appropriate for this particular designation in the plan. Let's go back just one second. Thanks. Then of course, and you'll almost always find PUD in the yellow category, by the way, unless it's the only one in the green category. Then at the very bottom, you've got the red category. That's sort of your stop. If you want if you're an applicant, you think you need one of those one of those zoning districts in that plan category, you're going to have an unfavorable approach unless you look at doing a plan amendment. So let's talk about sort of a little bit different approach to plan amendments if we're going to look at plan categories in this way. So the existing amendment process was subject to several criticisms when we did some stakeholder work. There was a comment that plan amendments happen very frequently. It turns out about 1 out of every 3 zoning applications also has a plan amendment application. So that sort of maybe meets the threshold of very frequent. Plan 4 has been amended over 100 times in the 10 years since it was adopted. There's always a sense of urgency associated with the plan amendment. It's attached to the zoning. They go along the process together. They're approved. Council approves those. If they approve those, they're approved with an emergency clause, so they take effect immediately. They usually, and this may be my kind of personal, professional take on it in terms of the level of effort. As a long-range planner, I'd like the level of effort to amend the plan to be of sufficient rigor. And we've received some comments that maybe that's not being done at this point. Then the final comment was there appears to be some confusion, not necessarily from this body, but from outside the city, between the amendment process and the zoning process. And so we think that with a few small changes to the process and using plan categories, we think we can address most of those criticisms. So, some important differences in the proposed plan amendment process. We imagine they'll be much less frequent. You can see that they cover more ground than the current kind of use-specific ordinance plan categories. So there's a little more flexibility for an applicant in working in some of those plan categories. We think we can make the amendment process obviously distinct and a separate action from zoning. In other words, if we don't treat those as companion items, an applicant would take their plan amendment application through the process with appropriate notice and separate hearings. If it's not, and then not treated as an emergency, it would then go into effect 30 days if council were to approve. Then you could move on with your zoning application. So that should help separate the fact that that's two kind of actions. One we're going to treat as a really big deal. You're amending the long-range plan. That should be a significant effort. And then the rezoning application process that we're familiar with now. And then we take the opportunity to kind of evaluate what fees look like for plan amendments across the region. And we think it's appropriate to increase the fee from $150 to $325. That's still pretty low in terms of communities that charge a fee to amend their plan. So let's look at quickly look at the amendment process and see how it might be similar to the process that we use now. We've created a template that's similar to the design statement that you see for PUDs. We created an amendment statement that includes these topics here. And in that amendment statement, we've given pretty specific directions to applicants in how you should address each of these topics. We feel that that'll help set the proper tone and stage for what should be involved with a plan amendment. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the next steps in the Edmond Plan update process are shown here. We would like to have a second public hearing at Planning Commission on November 6th. We'll be talking about actions and recommendations in the plan. That's the implementation section primarily. There's several of those I want to highlight for you. And then we'll be looking for Planning Commission's recommendation on the adoption of the plan update. Then a three-hearing process for City Council, both of their meetings in November, a similar breakdown in the approach with presenting the materials that we've seen here. So first, focusing in on the land use, how the plan is to be used and amended, and then the second one on actions and recommendations. And then their December meeting, we will be hoping to see an item to have the plan adopted. That concludes my formal comments. I'm happy to answer any questions the commission might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Are there questions or comments from the Planning Commission for Mr. Bryan or Mr. Enns?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Bryan, can we go back to the slide on the plan amendments, the first slide on that?
The next. Yes, we can go to that.
While she's getting there, there we go.
Okay.
Okay. As a 6-year commissioner on this body, I am all over in full agreement with the 4 bullet points on the front, on the top, under key criticism. Certainly the frequency and urgency. It appears we've averaged about 10 plan amendments per year over the last 10 years, approximately. Does that make sense? Okay, so if I'm assuming that any plan amendments that have been approved by this body and the council, those will be unaffected by this process. So if they're in place already, those will be unaffected. They won't have to reapply. For those in the audience and those watching on TV, that to gain clarity and certainty there, this is not a retroactive type of 2018 plan. It won't affect things that are already in place, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so whatever color appears on this categories in terms of plan amendments, so forth, that won't affect those that have been adjudicated, heard, and approved by the council or the commission for prior plan amendments. Is that right?
That's right. And in fact, the current ordinance plan types, land use types, we actually use those to strongly inform how we develop the plan categories. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the existing plan amendments that are prior, the 100
Yeah.
or so that are in place,
All
those are
folded in.
informing these plans? Okay.
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Okay. But this going forward will mandate a slowdown of the plan amendment process by, you emphasized over and over the word separate hearing. So a plan amendment could not be heard in conjunction with a PUD that needed a plan amendment. Did I understand you right?
That's what we're proposing, and that addresses kind of that urgency that, and so that does two things. It addresses the urgency component and the kind of the confusion between, we heard some feedback that, there was a public hearing on the plan amendment and everyone participated in that, and there was a vote and everyone got up and left, and they're like, well, wait, we have to come back. We need the zoning. The zoning's the very next thing. So to alleviate sort of that confusion, separating those two processes is the simplest approach we could think of. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, and I think it just also gives the plan amendment its due to give it its standalone hearing. It should indeed be a big deal to amend the plan. So.
Yeah, my question certainly wasn't to criticize it. I like it because the criteria is clearly different for a plan amendment and then a corresponding PUD. And I'm certainly in your space on that. Okay.
It may also be worth noting that, not to put too fine a point on it, but one of the advantages of having a long-range planner on staff is it might not always be the role of the private sector and applicants to amend the plan. I would expect that this body would hear from me on a much more frequent basis. There's a change in conditions, utility system is extended, new fire stations constructed, whatever it is, it may be appropriate for me to come and talk about the plan response to those changing conditions. And that will require that, we provide that, staff provides that sufficient rigor in the amendment process, not wait for the private sector to, request a plan amendment. So that'll be a little bit of a change in kind of the process, and I think that'll be a welcome addition to the overall kind of approach to comprehensive planning, based on what I've heard, just in the short time I've been here.
One last follow-up question.
Yes,
if
sir.
I could. So it may require you, Mr. Bryan, to be here and address applicants' issues or concerns, but assuming this has all gone through staff, with you part of the staff on a proposed plan amendment, correct? That's how it would typically work. And then if the chair or this commission or even our city planner said, oh, we need our long-range planner here because of this unique issue, then you would come. Because you haven't been a fixture necessarily since you've been here at every meeting before, right?
That's true.
Okay, so we're contemplating leveraging your expertise more as plan amendments come.
Yeah, and
I'm okay committing to more meetings.
Yeah. At this point, I think it's appropriate to talk about the much less frequent bullet.
The much less frequent what?
The bullet that points out that they're much less frequent.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
We're all excited about that. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Mr. Moyer?
Sure.
Mr. Moyer?
Yeah. Ken, you answered my question before I got a chance to ask it, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyhow.
Please.
It seems to me like there ought to be some time during this whole process of trying to keep it updated that you could come to us and say, we need to make some changes now because of such and such and so forth. So I was assuming that there'd be some way that we could identify a time frame. When is it needed to do that? Do we just wait till you tell us, or do we Is there some way, I mean, there ought to be some kind of a, I can't put it exactly like I'm thinking about it, but just seems to me like there ought to be at some point in time that we know it's just time to make a change.
Yeah, I think, and congratulations for skipping ahead a bit. There's some implementation language that we'll talk about next time about outreach and kind of incorporation of Planning Commission, other bodies within the city that have recommending responsibilities in terms of capital projects and those kinds of things. We can certainly provide some more detail into an action item like that that would say, make sure that the Planning Commission should hear about what the status is on the comprehensive plan every whatever it would be. That level of detail would be appropriate.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes, sir.
The only thing I believe is this is what we're getting at in being less reactive by you being able to be involved. So rather than having to basically always look at what the applicant's wanting, that you will be able to go ahead and send notice out and let people know that we see changing conditions, which you had indicated that rather than having the plan that everyone relies upon now and argues, well, this is what it says, and it may be outdated for 5 years by the methodology that you're talking about, it's going to be constantly evolving. I guess we shouldn't use the word constantly since it says much less frequent, but you are going to be watching to see the change in conditions and bringing that to our attention on a more regular basis.
Yeah, I would hope that would be the case, for sure.
No, go ahead.
Another follow-up question. So for applicants in the future, if approved, we would be proposing separate freestanding notices for a plan application, which would add additional costs to an applicant, I assume, for posting all the notices. Like on a recent applicant, we had seven separate posted notices. So there would be now 14 such notices required, assuming the plan amendment was approved, and they would have to repost for the an accompanying PUD, perhaps. Or could we allow for, if the process is in place and they know there's separate hearings, can they save money by just posting one joint notice and separate dates? Or
I think it would be two separate notices now. I mean, those signs are constructed in such a way it's fairly easy to reuse if you do it right, where you could just mark out rezoning or comp plan amendment to zoning and change the dates. It's the same process.
Right,
more or less.
right,
So,
but just doubled.
yes.
Okay.
So let's just, Acme Development comes in, and I'll just turn to the first one, Mid-Century Neighborhood. And they come in, they want to have a development. And under the green, they come in, they meet the criteria listed in these 6 subsections under Mid-Century Neighborhood. Everybody comes in with an open ear, right? They come in and ask for something in the yellow, the possible zoning districts. What happens then?
Okay, so that's a good question, and here's why. We would imagine you'd still be subjected to the same amount of analysis that you are now, and we've told you, Mr. or Mrs. Applicant, what you need to address in your application for your plan, for your, I guess, your zoning in this case, especially highlighting those kind of possible districts. And so for the Mid-Century Neighborhood example, we have some performance criteria here that are designed to give an applicant some quantifiable way to say how they're going to address compatibility and fit into the nearby developed area and those kinds of things. So say, for example, a good example might be they have a really small site, or it's got some weird, it's undeveloped for some reason. Maybe it's got floodplains or some odd easements, and so there's additional work they have to do to cause that to happen. well, they might be requesting a more dense zoning just to help make that work. So it's possible that's appropriate. They would need to describe to us in fairly good detail why that's appropriate. Now, by the same measure, if you come in and you go, well, I'm going to, and I don't know that this would actually happen, but if you say you were to buy up a very large block and want to go, well, you said I could put offices there, so I'm going to put D1 all on there. Well, that's not appropriate. We've clearly said that does not meet these, you could not meet these criteria that we've given you to do that type of project. And so the process would work the same way. You get either a favorable or unfavorable recommendation from staff. You're still welcome to come to this body and plead your case. But I would imagine, hopefully, we've given everyone the tools they need to have kind of a pretty rigorous discussion about that, and then they'd be subjected to the same.
So if Acme Development comes in and they're in the yellow and they don't satisfy the staff, then the staff recommendation would be an unfavorable.
I would imagine that would be the case. And
if they come in and ask in the red, you first ask them, are you colorblind? Can you not see that? And then they would have a highly unfavorable recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, that would
I think what I'd like to see is if it's unfavorable, say it's unfavorable, and if it's just absolutely off the charts unfavorable, have a higher category.
Yeah.
I mean, let people know that, let us know, let the citizens know that this is coming, but it has received the highest level of dissatisfaction from the city staff.
Well, and it's kind of even worse than that, because what we imagine is that these kind of districts in the red here, they're not in conformance with the comprehensive plan.
They can amend it.
Yeah, I mean, you can. So that would be an avenue that you could take. You could go to, we have the amendment process, and
even though it's in the red.
Yes.
It's absolutely unfavorable for the staff. They can still have that opportunity.
But then you're going to have, yes,
Yeah.
but you're going to have to go to a pretty rigorous review in order to amend the plan, and then you could get that zoning, only if that plan amendment was approved.
And this is a great example, because the mid-century neighborhood, I mean, it's kind of even hard to imagine what plan category you'd be asking for. I mean, you're not going to turn a mid-century neighborhood into a suburban neighborhood. It just doesn't, they're not work together at all like that. So, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, to your original question about how the staff report would look, I would anticipate not many that are in the red would even get to you necessarily, because
Okay,
it's a hard no.
Okay.
If they wanted to come and plead their case, they could, but I mean, the most simplest response from staff is going to be, it's not in conformance with our comprehensive plan. If it's in the yellow, the answer could still be no, and then we would go into detail why it didn't meet either the performance criteria or the context or character of the area. So this is not appropriate there.
Okay.
So this is
Or
going to give you all.
it does.
This will give staff the tools when something within the yellow area comes in, that you'll be able to address the performance criteria and the other things, which will give us better tools to be more informed as to what the determination was by staff for the things. So if an applicant insists on bringing something in, that we're going to have the proper methodology to examine what they're doing or why they're doing it, and why you agree or disagree that it would be appropriate.
And it gives the applicant the same language to use. I mean, if they feel that we've misinterpreted what they're proposing or something like that, they could start using the details up here if they can make it work to do the same thing, to justify the project.
I really like the color coding, green, yellow, red. I think those need, red being the incompatible. Have you all discussed, and is it even appropriate to suggest to not lay so much of this on staff? Okay, well, that's clearly in Mr. or Mrs. Applicant, that's clearly an incompatible zoning district. It's in the red. But you feel apparently strongly that you want a hearing in front of the Planning Commission and/or the City Council on this. That's their right.
That's their right.
Okay. Have you discussed the possibility of possibly bumping yellow up to a supermajority vote by the commission as part of, or a unanimous opinion if you migrate to red? And I don't even know if that's even applicable under, if we can even do that, but it would signal and give some political cover for staff. Hey, you're in red, but you can plead your case if you want to take the time. But just understand that if you're in red, it's going to take a unanimous decision. Had you thought about that or discussed it? Or is that even common in this industry?
We didn't have that conversation. You're still requesting something that's out of conformance with the comprehensive plan. So that's, your zoning's required to be in conformance with your plan by state statute. So I'm not sure if that would, I mean, of course, the adopting ordinance that we're looking at now doesn't incorporate
any of that.
Well, for
That
things in
type
the
of-
red, it would
that type
definitely
of
mean
thought.
that. For things in the yellow, we haven't had that conversation,
Yeah.
if that's what you're questioning.
Because like I said in our little meeting, I mean, there's a lot of people see yellow on a traffic signal and hit the gas.
Exactly.
And so that means you got to slow down or stop.
Proceed with
Okay.
caution.
If it is indeed a higher standard, then perhaps this body ought to apply a higher standard.
Why wouldn't you anyway?
Well, I would think, but if you had it in there procedurally, that if you're in the red zone, it requires unanimous approval by the then sitting commission to waive it and approve the plan. It might be something to think about.
I like it.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yes, sir, Mr. Moyer.
I just think it would be time to commend the staff for the work they've done on this. It's a good start for us.
Absolutely.
I do too. I
You're
agree with
welcome.
that. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Moyer.
Thank you.
Are there additional commission comments or questions? Okay. Public comments?
Good evening. I didn't plan on coming tonight, so I wore shorts. My name's Todd McInnes.
That's in the red category.
It is in the red category. Might everybody stand up there to make sure I'm not the only one in the red category.
Oops.
Christy, can you go back to the slide that had the 6 criteria and the red and yellow that we're talking about? I think, yeah. So I appreciate Mr. Bryan and his expertise. I really do. And I'm really asking questions. I think I probably have a predisposition towards the private marketplace, so I'll confess that on the front end. But so I'm just asking for some direction. So if I come and I'm asking, well, let me back up. I'm assuming the new Edmond Plan 2018 may have some land use identification changes to what land might be currently in the plan as. There may be a piece of land at 33rd and Broadway, for example, that's a silly example, that's in the plan 4 as something, and in Ed Plan 18, it's in something as something else. Is that possible, or are we changing any of the plan use categories as they exist today?
That is possible.
So if I own a piece of land, it's possible that its plan identification is going to be different in this plan than what it was in Edmond Plan 4? Or is that what I'm
But
asking?
Plan 4 fed into that, so I mean, it informed it, so it's not going to be wildly different.
Okay, but it's possible. So let's just say that my land that I own has been changed in Edmond Plan 18 through no action of my own. I'm sitting at home and now I'm projected differently than what I was before. So if I want to come and I want to change that, what am I asking as far as for it to be changed to that's different than the zoning use? Does that make sense, what I'm asking? I'm trying to figure out, if I came for and asked for a plan amendment, what's my request? I'm asking it to be from A to B.
Well, I mean, it'd be from one plan category to another, so I mean, it would require a little bit of rigor on your part to justify why that would be necessary.
Even though it just got changed, presumably without my input, and I was happy with what it was in Edmond Plan 4. Let me pick an example. We were just here a couple weeks ago on 33rd and I-35. That was in the Edmond Plan 4 as lake residential.
Yeah.
Presumably because there weren't utilities down there, although surely no one thought you're going to have a lot of houses on I-35, but nonetheless. And so presumably in the Edmond Plan 4, that's lake residential as we know it is. In this one, it's going to have a category of I-35? Okay, so it'd be I-35.
Which it also had in the other plan. I mean, it had two
It
designations
had
in the other
the
plan.
corridor was laid over the top of it, okay. But we had to do a plan amendment, we didn't have to. We came and asked you for a plan amendment because it was lake residential, which seemed outdated.
And it was because of the utility question.
Yeah.
So because the utilities had been extended there, it's now a higher category, that I-35 category by itself.
So I guess my fear is that there's other examples of that may exist today that are not appropriately identified in the plan for their land use. And once this gets adopted, it sounds like it could be very difficult to amend it. And so I'm not trying to get around it or anything. And so I'm trying to figure out if the appropriate use in this example is A, single family A, presumably up to 6 units per acre, and that's kind of it. And it sounds like it's going to be even really difficult to zone it to the possible districts or to change it to the possible districts based on kind of the last 5 minutes of conversation, knowing we already have a supermajority requirement for an emergency as it exists today. So I'm just trying to figure out if I'm coming with one of my clients and now I've got to spend theoretically twice as much. My mailing list costs $300. My sign costs $485. Presumably, I'm taking a risk, right? And someone's paying an attorney to come up here once. And I think the reason it got merged into two things was out of practicality. It wasn't because not to give it the service that it was due. That's why we still have the 4-vote requirement on the emergency. And again, I'm not arguing about it. I'm just asking from a practical standpoint. If I come up here and I'm doing this, and admittedly, while the government is a great identifier of land use, the private marketplace dictates a lot of development. And so it's really difficult when we have private developers that come to town and want to risk capital and say, hey, this is where I want to go. I know Edmond wants there to be redevelopment of downtown. Well, right now we haven't had a private developer that wants to come in and do that. They want to do it out on I-35. And so for us to come in here and say, hey, we like what the theory was, but we want to change it. I mean, I just want us to keep in mind who drives a lot of that and to say, hey, once he says it, and I know you're not saying that, he knows more about it than I do, then that's kind of it unless 5 of us agree here at this level, and who knows at city council what that might be. And so I was just asking, I guess I'm saying, the separate hearing, I believe has some value. I don't know if if it gets approved and the analysis for the zoning that's within that new category is presumably allowed, why we need to come back a second time 30 days later. I'm sure you could have 2 hearings. They kind of got melded together, like I said, out of just informality and practicality over the years. We could separate those out at the hearing and not say, hey, we're going to hear items 6 and 7 together. It seems like you could get a lot of that done from the standpoint, from my perspective. And so I was just asking a couple of those issues. I was asking about any changes in my land that may exist today that's going to have a different use tomorrow or presumably after this gets approved. I think the landowners that are impacted by that need to know.
Yeah. And keep in mind, I mean, I know you realize this, but just so people hear it, any zoning entitlements that are there today remain intact. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not changing anybody's zoning with this.
Yeah.
So if you've gone through the process to get your land use plan, the update from the Edmond Plan 4 and the zoning done, it's there today. Mm-hmm. As far as the changes up or down, it was so informed by the previous plan, I can't imagine there being too many cases where it was taken down. But we can spend some time looking at that. And I don't know if you have a better answer to that.
No, we can. Yeah, we've tried to. We folded in entitlements as well. So
right.
Unless you got something rezoned in the last 3 to 4 months, that should be reflected in here. And keep in mind, it's not the same. Like it's not a 1-to-1 relationship with zoning when you under this approach, except in the example that's on the screen. But
Single family.
Yeah, for the most part, it's not really a 1-to-1. This is really trying to get at how the development looks and how the context is and those kinds of things. And so a more typical example for a plan amendment in this area might be that, say there's an area right now that's a rural neighborhood and it's undeveloped. And it's rural neighborhood because it doesn't have utilities, there's no local streets, it's just kind of open section, 2-lane roads. If utilities are extended to that area, or a plan for utilities are extended to that area, the private sector may respond very quickly to that and need a new plan category that fits there. So any party could lead that kind of effort. If the development sector is moving very quickly, it might just be more efficient for them to go through the plan amendment process as opposed to wait for staff to go through the next mini update if we're going to come every 6 or 18 months or whatever it would be. And we would say, hey, remember we had that plan to extend utilities. It's now, rural neighborhood is not a good fit anymore. It's more like a different category. We propose that it be changed to that. So there's more opportunity for staff to participate when there's been significant change in conditions.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
I mean, and I hear what you're saying, but I've actually got, like I said, a slightly different approach as to what I believe I've heard, and maybe I'm being optimistic, but I believe by breaking down the meetings into 2 meetings, I mean, how many times are we here on a plan amendment and all of a sudden we're talking about site plan issues? So I believe it's going to basically go ahead and create an expedited method that we should be able to get things through more quickly and hopefully be able to educate the public in a manner that's reasonably polite and nice to say, hey, that's not what we're here about. And we're not even going to hear about that at this point in time. And what I heard, and the way it was originally explained when we were talking about it in meetings on the different way of breaking down the criteria on what would be appropriate, what would not be appropriate, is when it's in yellow, I'm not hearing that, okay, if it's a use that falls within the yellow, it's something that should basically be denied. And I don't necessarily agree that it should be something that's being done by a supermajority personally, because I believe that what this is going to do is give measurable criteria to take a look and examine and see, does that fit in those uses? And I also believe that the ultimate goal will be with the city staff and having Mr. Bryan available to us, again, that we're going to be more proactive versus reactive to situations. And it's my hope that as private development comes in and looks at a particular area where a change has been made and criteria and factors are there, that there's interest, that rather than having to wait for the applicant to come in, an individual landowner, that we're going to be able to come in and look at something just like we did here with that I-35 area. Because the difference between the water and everything, I mean, it changed the entire composition of that area that you've just been discussing. And so what I heard is not, yes, it does separate out the procedure, but it was my hope that by doing that, and that's one of the things that we had talked about when we had our meetings, was let's find a way to stop the confusion where we're not here to talk about site plan issues. We're not here to talk about zoning day. We're talking about a plan amendment. That's all we're talking about right now. And so I believe that the process is going to go quicker. And again, because of what I foresee as being measurable criteria, these are the things that you need to look at to see, is that yellow use, is it going to be applicable? We're going to have more unified standards that we can look at, so that a member of the public who disagrees or they don't understand why something's coming in, hopefully we'll give them the tools to examine it and perhaps have a better understanding as to why we make decisions that are incredibly unpopular on a regular basis. And a lot of people walk out and I don't think they ever understand why, what we look at and what city staff looks at.
No, and I appreciate that, Mark. I really do. I guess I have just 3 quick comments about that. One, I think to know what my application looks like, if I'm coming in to apply to amend the plan, I would assume there's going to be a pretty good rigorous analysis as to what my intended zoning use is going to be, or else why would I be wanting to amend the plan? I mean, I would imagine Mr. Bryan would have a conversation and say, okay, you want to amend the plan, but what are you trying to get to? I mean, are you trying to go from Lake Residential to E1? Or so there's a pretty good analysis of that, I would imagine, that gets kind of flushed out in the plan amendment application process. And I'm not saying it needs to be one hearing. I think it just has happened over time. I was a lawyer about 6 months, and Charles flipped on me, and I got 4-0 against on an emergency after I got my zoning. And so I was like, after I got the plan amendment, I didn't know what even happened. I left there thinking I knew what happened, and I didn't know. So I'm not opposed to that. I'm just saying I think you can do it another way and not incur greater expense, but I certainly defer to you guys on that. The second thing that I think I would say is I think it would be fair, if you can, to identify landowners whose land use projection is changing as a result of this plan. One, because there's been a very informal and relatively easy, if you want to use y'all's words or whatever, plan amendment process up until now, so you haven't given it a lot of weight. I don't have to worry about it. I do have to worry about it, but it's not like prohibitive. Where now, as soon as this gets adopted, I would imagine both of the council and the planning commission is going to be very hesitant to amend it for a while. Why would we? We just approved it. So I think it'd be reasonable as a private property landowner to have a knowledge that, hey, your situation's getting ready to change. And the third thing I would just say, I'd echo what Mr. Moyer said. I appreciate all this effort. Randy and I've had this conversation. I know Bob and I did for years. I mean, we became the reactive commission as opposed to the planning commission. And I think something like this, anytime we give certainty to people, they're going to risk more capital from my perspective. And so the more we can do that, the better. And I appreciate the expertise and knowledge, and I'll be happy to be involved in the process as just one person, but I really do appreciate it. Sorry to take up so much time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Are there others? Yes, sir, on the back row. If you could identify yourself, please.
Yes. Hi, I'm Richard Reich. I came before the commission.
Yes, sir.
On the 17th from Mountain View Park, where then we went to City Council on 9/24, where it was turned down. And I think I'm getting this from Mr. Rainey and Mr. Entz, but what was determined in that meeting was the applicant wanted to zone something as L5 commercial that was L2, which was residential. Does that stand under the new plan? I think I heard yes, but I would like to confirm that.
I mean, that decision's not overturned by updating the plan.
Right.
Now, I have to be honest, I don't know what that specific site is in the new plan.
It is large, or the first one, the green one.
So it'd be rural. So, I mean.
Rural, yeah, rural.
Give me a second.
No, I read this afternoon too, so I remember.
We love doing staff reports on the fly.
You don't have this memorized yet?
Do you have a second question?
Yeah, Pete, you were talking about the Lake District and that, and the water protection area, I believe you called it, and that would be appropriate for PUD. And does PUD override any of the existing zoning plans that you have laid out already on this map?
PUD is a specialized zoning, so it would be the new zoning for that, for any area where they tried to rezone. So what we're saying is there's not an appropriate zoning category that would allow you to do kind of the protective stuff you need to do for the water restoration area. So PUD is really the only vehicle you can do that. So you'd have to put in specific ways you're going to slow down the water running off your site, particular low impact development practices you're going to put in place in that PUD to guarantee that it would happen. So. And
then before all the public hearings and that, I was just going through this thing and I had like 8 to 10 questions. How is it appropriate to ask these questions? Is it in, I don't want to take any more of you guys' time tonight, but can we address these to the staff, or are you guys going to be overwhelmed with this?
No,
please do.
Absolutely. You got 30 days between now and the next Planning Commission meeting where this will be discussed.
Okay.
So I think Mr. Bryan and Mr. Enns are happy to receive your emails.
Okay.
If you don't have their email address, they'll get them to you.
I can get them.
That's absolutely appropriate.
And then did L5 disappear in this new plan?
L5 is a zoning category, so L5 still exists today. The zoning categories aren't changing. This is all plan categories dealing with the long-range plan.
Okay.
So
I didn't see it in any of on the bottom of those slides where it's green, yellow, or red.
it should be in there still. But,
okay. Again, I read this in like an hour this afternoon. So those are all my questions. I appreciate your time.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Are there others?
To help on that question, Mr. Chair, when you say all Ls, that means L5?
Yes.
Okay.
Anything with that
so
L
the
starting
designation all Ls, like on the bottom of mid-century neighborhood, would include L5?
Okay.
Mr. Ish?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Ernie Ish, and I represent developers, and So I'm speaking to you from that background. But I'd also like to speak to you about some experience in my few years in business as a planner. And I hope that Mr. Bryan and Mr. Ince will agree, and the members of the Planning Commission, that a plan is a guide and a tool to use to help staff and Planning Commission and council to make decisions. It is not something that it's adopted. It can never change. This is what it is. And so I hope that in your review of applications to amend the plan, you will keep in mind that it is a living, breathing organism that is subject to change of the various factors that have been pointed out by Mr. Bryan. So I have Acme Land Development that wants to come in, and they're willing to spend the money to put in a sewer lift station or extend a mile or 2 miles of off-site water line in order to upgrade the value of their property. And I would hope if the staff and the Planning Commission and the council would consider that in considering the application for a plan amendment. I would also hope that that we wouldn't drag things out forever to get from my client entering into a contract to purchase a piece of property for development. And normally, those of you in the real estate business know that 90 to 120 days is about the limit on doing your due diligence to accomplish whether or not you want to close on that piece of property. And part of that due diligence is acquiring the plan amendment and the zoning to make that property qualify to do what I want to do. So I would hope that, and take into consideration also the citizens who come for the hearing on the plan amendment, and 60 days later, we go through the notice process and everything, they're coming back again for the zoning hearing and coming back again for the site plan hearing. So it's not only a load for the citizens, but as much as it is for the developer, my client. So I would hope that you would take that into consideration when you set up your timing between a plan amendment application and a zoning application. I hope you don't come back and tell me that the plan amendment's got to be approved before you can file a zoning change amendment. I'm okay with hearing the plan amendment on one meeting if we can then come back 30 days later or 2 weeks later for the zoning hearing, and cut down the overall time frame to accomplish this. You know, a person comes in to me and says, I want to buy this piece of land, I want to develop it into single-family lots or commercial application. If it's single-family lots, he says, and I want to get this done, I'm in a hurry, I've got this money invested. And I always open my conversation with a new client and say, from this meeting to have finished lots on the ground for you to sell to a builder is 1 year. And most everybody, their eyes get big and their mouth drops. That's under the current system and under the current conditions. Now that varies due to weather, due to climate, due to a lot of things. Can go a little faster sometimes. Sometimes it goes a lot longer. You remember a year not too long ago, 2011, I believe, where it rained from May through August. And I had 3 or 4 developer clients very unhappy with myself and with the contractors who were supposed to be out there digging water and sewer trenches and putting in paving, but they couldn't work because of the weather. And that one, during that time frame, it drug on forever. So I would hope that you would take that into consideration. And as I said, let the plan be a living organism. And yes, allow a developer to come in here and ask for a plan amendment. And if it's 10 a year, if you reduce that to 5, or if you leave it at 10, that's still something that the Planning Commission and the council can take into account and make a decision on. So think about not only the citizens who have to respond to each one of those notices, but think of the time frame and the investment that a developer client has involved in making a decision to do a project that benefits the city of Edmond. If it's a commercial and is going to increase the sales tax revenue to the city budget, that's a factor. If it's new homes that are going to provide a lot of dollars in construction materials and labor and to build a new home that's going to benefit the city of Edmond, again, through sales tax revenue. Think about that aspect of it from the city as well. So I hope you'll take all of those things into consideration when you consider the plan amendment process and the zoning process and how much you want to separate those. I have no problem with them being separate hearings. That's fine. But please don't tell me that it's going to, I'm going to have a plan amendment approved by the city council before I can file a zoning change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ish. Are there others? Good evening, Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Reeser, yes.
Come on up here.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, if you've got a piece of property that's zoned now.
Pull that microphone to you just a little bit.
If you've got a piece of property that's zoned now, whatever it may be, and the way I've heard this in going into a yellow zone or red zone, there's a good possibility you're going to be downzoning somebody's property.
No.
No?
We're not affecting anybody's property as far as it's currently zoned right now. We're not taking anybody's zoning away that is right now. We are not affecting anyone's zoned property.
Are these people going to be informed to come to the next meeting that they've got a zoning and they want to be informed that they're not going to be rezoned or downzoned? Because the information that the public got today was very minimal at best. These meetings like this should be advertised for the population of the people here to know that what it's going to cover, it should be transparent of what it's going to cover when they've got own property that's zoned. I don't own it. But here's the other thing that's going to happen. In the last 12 years, I believe we had a group from Pearl Street in Colorado that come in and had a magnificent idea how to rework Edmond, Oklahoma. And then about 4 years ago, we had a group we had some extra money, so we wanted to spend it. And so we went down to Fort Worth and got a group of people come up, and they had a walkabout program. That means that they want less traffic and want more people and pedestrians downtown. Now we went through that process. We got the zoning, or we got the buildings to be built, but no parking. And it's just not consistent. A recent one we passed was 50 apartments to be built, along with about 4,000 square foot of commercial, 40,000 commercial buildings, and they couldn't tell that the apartments was residential, and it shouldn't have got the 25% discount in parking, and commercial did, but they give the whole thing 25% discount. So a 2-bedroom apartment that has to have 2 parking spaces got 1.5, and the one-bedroom apartment that had to have 1.5 parking places got one. So, you know, there is a possibility of being downzoned, and that was one of them. So I really think we should have advertising in 2 local papers and the Oklahoman to let people know that these meetings like this are going to take place. Yesterday I called 3 people, 1 council person, and finally ended up getting to the manager's office to find out what this is going to be about tonight. And that's the best but we heard it on Channel 4 that there was going to be, this zoning was going to take place tonight. But thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Pete. I think the city staff will make certain that the website's for sure updated. It may already be, but the dates of the future hearings will be reflected, as well as the topics of those meetings.
A press release was always also put out, and that will be refreshed over time. So.
Okay, thank you. Are there others? Any additional public comment? Mr. Mayor, hello.
Hey, how are you doing?
Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, my name's Dan O'Neill. I'm from Thunderhead Hills, one of those mixed neighborhoods, old neighborhoods, I think is the terminology for.
You're older than the neighborhood is.
I'm not quite that old. Wished I was that old. First thing we would obviously ask for is that the suburban neighborhood and the mixed neighborhood, any distinction between that go away. You know, that would be sort of an interesting, it's making a real subtle distinction, I think, between housing and if it's a viable neighborhood and it's going good and they have people taking care of it and they're having the houses selling at tremendous prices. It sounds to me like it's a regular suburban neighborhood, okay? The other question I have is PUDs, and it's been brought up. But, you know, 90% of the zoning requests you have here are PUDs, and sometimes it's sort of hard to figure out whether they're really doing a multifamily in there or they're doing intense commercial or whatever. So it creates a problem if we don't at least address it right now. And I think the last thing is everybody is concerned about the specificity of what has been done. And so we're sort of used to, and to be perfectly honest, there's very little area in our community, I think, fit into that criteria they call infill. We haven't decided what we're going to do there yet, or we haven't approved a zoning to match it or something. Most of it's pretty well been decided. It may not have been developed that way, but it's pretty well been decided. And so if I'm buying a house next to a vacant lot and it was approved by the city council that it would be office and the zoning and the plan matches that zoning, I ought to be able to look at a map and see that, okay? And coloring it yellow and calling it suburban neighborhood or calling it something green or yellow, that doesn't help me, okay? When I see the zoning map and it says it is office, that tells me something. I don't need to have an explanation of what's suburban neighborhood. So this is really, and I like the red, yellow, and green, okay? I like that criteria, but that's more of a planning consideration. This is how any changes are to be reviewed. Not necessarily, and how we are projecting this area, that'd be fine, but it's sort of a little separate thing than what we've actually done and what's on the books. And so that would give the current owners their assurance that what we've had on the books is approved and blessed and it's there and everybody can see it. One of the criteria you have in their evaluation here, Mark, Counselor, is compatibility. And, you know, they're trying to see if this was compatible. Sometimes it is site plan considerations that makes a project more compatible to the residents or to somebody that might have an objection to apartments next door to them. And so that's why you always get into that discussion, you know. Well, if they just do this, this, and that, I'd be happy and I'm out of here, okay? And so that's why it comes up, okay? And there's a lot of people that, in that same group of people, that don't want apartments anywhere, but there's other guys in the neighborhood there that says, well, gee, if they do this, this, and that, it would be compatible. So that's why it keeps coming up. And part of his job is to evaluate compatibility. And so that's why it happens. We also went through the same process of splitting up the thing, I think 10 years ago, when we talked about the original Plan 4. Okay. And putting it together, it helps the developers too, you know, putting both issues together. It also helps the neighborhoods. I mean, how many times have we been dragged through these things? And to get here and to have a last-minute cancellation, I mean, Randall's notorious for making those kind of things happen. And timing is everything and all that kind of stuff. So whatever we can do to facilitate the process in terms of reducing the angst, shall we say, for the residents involved in the process, I think is a good idea. And I understand exactly why we have been shortchanging the criteria that we approved before for evaluating whether to approve a plan change. I understand that. I've watched that happen, and we're not following our own rules on that. I mean, we have some pretty stringent rules on what the criteria should be. But anyway, it does facilitate the process and reduce the angst when you can get to a decision one way or another on an issue. And so I'm sort of like the way it works right now, or it appears to be a good idea in the long run for our community.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time. Anybody else? Public comment? Okay. Commission comments, additional comments from the commission? Or do we want to take this in and, I guess, what is the date on that? The next one, November, what, 6th?
November 6th.
November 6th?
Mr. Chairman, just wanted to, staff can always do a better job in providing information to the public. There's no question about that. But I want to make it clear that we posted on our website on September 28th that we were going to be holding public hearings to discuss the Edmond Plan update. There was also a press release issued at that same time. And I don't know what the newspapers published the press release. I have no idea. But on our website, it indicates City of Edmond holding public hearings to discuss Edmond Plan update. Gives the dates that we're going to be talking about that: October 2nd, November 6th, November 13th, November 26th, December 10th. Those are all dates that we've identified as a staff. Those dates could change based upon the direction of the Planning Commission, could change on the direction of the City Council. Staff doesn't tell the Planning Commission or City Council that you need to do this on such a date. We're trying to provide a framework for it. Now, also, I think it's important. We've got these maps available. These are maps. We're glad to give one to everyone here tonight. It tells exactly staff's best effort estimate under these plan categories that have been discussed tonight. A particular location, where the property is, you can identify any piece of property in Edmond, and you can see where we're projecting a plan category. It is not the zoning. It is a plan category. It does not change the zoning that is on our website right now for every piece of property in Edmond. So I want to make it absolutely clear, we are not changing anybody's zoning by this. Now, we can argue about plan or whether or not this is the right way to do it. I understand that completely, but this is what we're, as a staff, projecting as it relates to plan categories, each of the ones that we've identified tonight through our hearing. We're not hiding anything. It's all here. Glad to give you any information, answer any of your questions. That's all I got to say about that.
Thank you, Mr. Murdoch.
There's some right up here for you if you'd like.
Now, Mr. Bryan, Mr. Enns, their emails are on the website. They'll be happy to give them to you. They'll be happy to tell you tonight what they are. Go ahead and tell them.
It's randy.enns@edmondok.com.
Mr. Bryan?
So it's ken.bryan, there's no T, B-R-Y-A-N, at edmondok.com. You can also reach all of the staff in the planning department by using planning@edmondok.com.
And they're located right next door, and if you don't want to email or call them or write a letter, walk over there and ask for an appointment and talk to them. So that concludes tonight's comments on the Edmond Plan 2000, or the comments and discussion on Edmond Plan 2018. We're going to have another meeting on November 6th to take a look at the input we've received, to have additional discussions, and a possible vote with a recommendation on November 6th. So please feel free to reach any of the city staff, any of the members of the Planning Commission, and we'll see you in a month on that topic.